So in case you couldn't tell already, this is a seriously fun guy. And today I'm going to walk you through my step-by-step process for how I put this together. So this whole thing started with a question. Could I take a digital 3D model, this little mushroom man, and build a physical world for him to stand in? A world with real texture, real depth, and his own little story. So the first step was to find the models that I wanted to use for this project and get them printed out, which is where I found the mushroom man, the mushrooms I'll use, as well as the column which I cut down into the pedestal. From there, I just take the utility knife and carve down some XPS foam to create the ground that he'll be standing on. I make sure to slowly slice off each edge very carefully and work it down until I'm happy with it, not taking off too much at one time, and ending up with a base that I'm just not really happy with. So you'll see here that I'm slowly working around the edges as well as slowly creating that channel through the center, just making small slices and cutting off one small piece at a time until I get to a shape that I'm happy with. Now as this XPS foam block gets to the shape that I'm happy with and closer to what it needs to be, I'll just put up against the base here and slowly start trimming it away more, test fitting my pieces and making sure that the spacing and everything else works nicely. So once I'm happy with that, I'll just take my hot glue and place it over the bottom before firmly attaching that to the foundation. Now once you put it on there, I do have a couple seconds to wiggle with it to make sure it's perfectly in place, and I'm able to move on to the texturing, which for that I'll just take some small gravel as well as a little bit of sand, and I'll just combine those in a small cup that doesn't really matter if I get all nasty. So for that, I did probably about a 1-to-1 ratio for each of those, and then added some burnt umber as the base color, as well as some Elmer's glue to help kind of bind it together. And then mix that together real nicely. Now for the texture I was going for was just kind of a really rough, rocky, sandy texture, but I wouldn't say there's a recipe for that, just kind of whatever you feel would be good for a project you're working on. It also adds some plaster to it just to help thicken it up and let it dry a little faster before taking a little bit of nutmeg brown to it to lighten it up just a little bit and get it a little bit closer to a muddy earth color. From there, it was just the matter of spreading it on there with a popsicle stick, making sure it's thin enough that you can see that texture through it, and covering up all of the XPS foam. Now this does overflow a little bit onto the base, but I'm able to take a paper towel of that here in just a moment to clean that up, but you just really want to make sure that you get all that foam covered up nicely. Now once it's dried, I went ahead and went back through with some of the burnt umber mixed with a little bit of the green skin army painter paint and mix it up to get kind of a mossy, muddy tone to it, as well as taking a sponge to it from there to add some color variation and a little bit more depth to the base itself. Now, once that's done, I'll just take some nutmeg brown and do a little bit of dry brushing over the top just to add in one more layer of highlights over the entire thing and really pull out that rough, rocky texture that's on the surface here. And that ends up giving you a pretty compelling looking earth. Now for painting the actual miniatures themselves, first up will be the Mushroom Man, and for him I'm just going to take some of the skeleton bone army painter war paint and give a nice heavy coat to his entire body. Now this did take a couple coats to actually get a full good coverage on that, so that's what I did, just making sure that it had plenty of time to dry, and then just using the burnt umber to base his staff as well. Now for the mushroom cap itself, I just took some of the bone paint with some of the burnt umber and mixed that together just to create a slightly offset tone that could be different to his body, and gave that a nice heavy coat. For the actual pattern on the top, I just took the same burnt umber and created just a brown spot there on the top, and then started pulling the brown paint down towards the cap to create some streaking and some color variation across the top there. This also helps to kind of grab some of the texture that's in the model. And then I also went around the base of the mushroom cap and started pulling back up towards the top, doing the same thing, just to get some color variation and also to help grab some more of that texture. You'll see here that the overbrushing will really grab some of those ridges and divots there, and once the wash is on there, it'll really lighten up the whole thing and give it some nice contrast. Now for the beard, I went ahead and just painted that white to start with, and that gave a pretty nice base there. Now to tie it all together, I just took some of the strong tone wash and watered that down just a little bit before applying it to the entire model. This will really flow into the grooves that you can see here really nicely and create some nice depth and texture onto this guy, so you can really see the quality of the model here. For me, this is probably one of the most satisfying parts of the paint job that really ties the whole thing together. Now, if you're curious about any of the resources or products I use for my crafting, be sure to check the links down below where I have a link of everything that I use for my projects. Also, if you have any questions about how to use those more in depth, feel free to join our Discord server absolutely for free, where you can chat with other artists and hobbyists and get their feedback as you're working on your project. Again, all those links will be down in the description for you. Now, you'll see here on the mushroom cap that this wash really does a really nice job at filling in those pits and tying those two tones together very nicely. Now, for those of you who are curious about the printer that I'm using for these models, it is the Bambu Lab A1 Mini. And if you'd like, there's a link right here that you can go check out, which will show you my first impressions and some of my test prints I've done to get situated with this printer, and just kind of my overall feedback of that. Not sponsored anyway by them, but just for those who might be curious, that'd be a good resource for you. Now onto the stone that I'm going to use for this. I'm just going to use my standard method of sponging on some red and yellow paint onto the stone before going on with some dry brushing. Now, if you do this, you want to make sure that you give each layer plenty of time to dry so you don't get any kind of smearing or smudging. A good trick to get that to dry faster is either use a hair dryer or just put it in front of a fan. Otherwise, this acrylic paint does dry pretty fast, so you have plenty of working time where you're not going to have to set it down and come back after a couple hours. All in all, I probably spent 10 or 15 minutes actually painting this whole stone with every step and just putting it in front of a fan here in my office. But you'll see as you build up each of these layers that you get more and more highlights and depth created by each of those progressing tones. And we'll finish it off with a little bit of dry brushing on white just to really grab those highlights and push up that contrast. Now, leaving at this, it does look fairly realistic, but it does also seem just a little too bright and stark. So to fix that, we'll just go back with some of the strong tone and cover that stone with that to help darken it down and kind of muddy it up. And then we'll go through with it a little stronger, not watered down as much, and just kind of dabble it into the deep recesses and some of the shadowed parts to really help drive up that depth and contrast there. Now onto the mushrooms themselves. And for these, I'll use this model pack here, and I will take the bone paint and cover these stems with those. Now with these, I do use a couple different variations just by adding either white to it or just using a brown base to create the stems. I kept these paint jobs very simple, single tone colors, and just enough coverage that it covers all of the black PLA there. But this was a fairly quick process, even going through all of these minis. To wrap them up, I'll just take some more of the strong wash tone over those, just to help tie everything together and look like it's all in the same universe. You'll see that it really pulls out the color pattern on these nicely and really combines them well as sinks into these depths and grooves to help create some more depth and texture on these models. Now, all of these models that I use can be found in the Bambu Lab studio, and I'll have links to all of those in the description as well. Once they were all completed, it was time to assemble those. And to do that, I just used some more hot glue and put a little dab of that on the bottom before placing each one in its space. Now, I didn't really have a solid plan for where these were going to go, just kind of eyeballed it and saw what looked right, while also maintaining an idea of where the mushroom man would be standing and just trying to keep the colors balanced across the entire build. So once he was firmly in place, it was time to work on wrapping it up. So for that, I'll just take some of the white PVA glue and take an old brush to spread that around the bottom, making sure that we're getting it up close to the bottom of the mushrooms to kind of help hide the base lines, as well as give the flocking a nice place to stick to. And for that, I'll just be using this fine blended turf and spraying that across the entire base very nicely and evenly. And finally, all that was left was to clean up the base by going through with some of the black acrylic paint and just repainting that entire thing to hide any kind of over sponging or brush strokes. So this is the final result. And ultimately, this project was a ton of fun, mixing digital tools like 3D printing with some old school hands-on foam carving. It's amazing how well these different methods can work together, and thanks for hanging out with me on this build. I hope you picked up a new trick or two and feel inspired to make a little world of your own. Let me know what you think in the comments. I'm always looking for new ideas of what to build next, and if you want to see more of this stuff, you know the deal. Until then, go craft something.